Australia is absolutely massive, and with that size comes advantages and challenges, making the raw size of this country both a strength and a weakness. Australia covers vast arid plains, it has huge deposits of precious metals, lands inhabited by Aboriginal peoples, and huge deposits of coal. Yet despite its huge footprint and vast resources, nearly 40% of the country is mostly uninhabited and potentially uninhabitable, a number that will potentially rise due to the effects of climate change. With the looming growing power of relatively nearby China, we've got to ask, what does Australia's future look like? The answer, as it turns out, is rather complex. Here's a fact that you'll all know from school. Australia is the world's smallest continent. When we're examining land on the continental scale, even being the smallest is massive. As we mentioned in our recent video on the United States, North America is a huge continent, ranging from temperate forests to deserts to swamps. Australia is not nearly so diverse. That's not to say that there's zero geographical diversity. The eastern side of the country is quite lush. The Blue Mountains of New South Wales were a large border for early colonists, with the area being particularly defined by the plethora of beautiful rock formations and forests containing eucalyptus trees. Also near the eastern edge of the country lies the Murray and Darling Basin, home of the Murray and Darling rivers. Respectively, these are the first and third largest rivers in the country, and the fertile basin has been a cradle for both agriculture and civilization, dating back to the earliest days of Australia's Aboriginal peoples. Once the convicts turned colonists who settled in Australia several hundred years ago crossed the natural barrier of the Blue Mountains, they were not greeted with lush valleys and farmland. Instead, all the colonists found was heat and venomous animals. Oh, and did I mention the nearly endless stretches of sand?
I don't like sand. It gets everywhere.
This is the Australian Outback. Stretching over 70% of the country, this arid expanse stretches from the edge of the Blue Mountains in the east to most of the way into Western Australia, in the, well, west. It stretches across almost all of the state of South Australia and into the territories of Northern Australia. Most of inland Australia outside of the major settlements is the Outback. While there are variations in how intense areas of the Outback can be to live in, a lot of the Outback can be characterized by red sand, a wild variety of animals, and temperatures that reach nearly 50 degrees Celsius in the hottest months. Almost all of the area officially designated Outback is dry. Most areas get fewer than 11 centimeters of rain each year. But many early British colonists were skeptical of a truly near uninhabitable area stretching across most of the continent existing until they encountered it themselves. And I mean it when I say it's sparse. See this map here? The shaded area contains a whole 2% of the Australian population. Now, some people have adapted to living in the Outback. I quickly want to mention two of these. One is the town of Alice Springs, a stunning oasis nearly in the center of the country. And the other is the town of Coober Pedy. Of note here because of the citizens dealing with the increasingly harsh summers by overwhelmingly moving into underground homes dug out of old mining quarries. Not to mention the indigenous people who lived in and around the Outback and have done so for thousands of years. They did this by traveling in small groups and truly only using the land for what they needed, whether in the bush or otherwise. And when food would run low in one area, their nomadic nature meant that they could get up and move somewhere else with more plentiful resources. It should be mentioned that the Aboriginal communities overwhelmingly seem to be against mass industrialization of their traditional homelands. And in traditional colonizer fashion, the colonists and their descendants overwhelmingly did not care and disregarded even previously seemingly settled land right treaties. This led to a long history of settlement and resource extraction on traditional indigenous lands. This eventually leads us to the modern day. A huge part of modern Australia, even out in the Outback, is mining. Mining is especially important to note here. I mean, sure, the interior is incredibly inhospitable and spread out, and a lot of these towns that are there are mining towns with dwindling populations. But what the Australian interior lacks in being hospitable is debatably made up for in its resources. Roughly 1/3 of the world's uranium resources come from the land down under, despite the country itself currently only having one operable nuclear reactor. Western Australia is home to a variety of precious metal mines, making Australia a notable exporter of gold and silver. Indeed, back in the 1800s, Australia even had its own gold rush. Also impressive are its reserves of iron ore, nickel, and diamonds. These have served as a major part of its economy, and over the course of the 20th century especially helped Australia compete economically on a global scale. And as of 2022, this work has made Australia grow into the world's 12th largest economy. But most notably and concerningly is the reliance on coal. Australia is a major coal producer. Actually, scratch that, with 550 million tons produced in 2019 and with mines located in every single state, it's easy to see how coal is one of Australia's largest exports. And despite having more than enough land to build solar panels and incredible large-scale wind power projects, Australia has a huge love affair with coal. Coal is Australia's largest energy resource, and as of 2016, they were the world's largest exporter of it. And I have to show you this clip of the infamous marketing intern turned Prime Minister Scott Morrison, 2 years before assuming that position, brought a lump of coal with him to the House of Representatives.
This is coal. Don't be afraid.
The
Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows the rule on crops.
It's coal. It was dug up.
Coal is dirty, and mining it and refining it causes 46% of carbon dioxide emissions worldwide each year. To be fair, a growing number of Australians are more concerned about fully tackling climate change. And Australia is a prime candidate for showcasing the raw power of renewable energy. Just 1,000 squared kilometers of solar panels could power the entire country. And the 5.6 million kilometer Outback could be a potentially great spot for this. And though Morrison later ascended to the Prime Ministership, something that perhaps shows that a continued number of Australians share similar views on the issues such as the coal industry, events such as the COVID-19 pandemic and the devastating bushfires of 2019 and 2020 perhaps have shown that this may be changing.
We are on the outskirts of the biggest catastrophe, and our government is doing nothing!
Especially as Morrison himself just faced a widely celebrated defeat in the recent Australian election. But coal output has increased in Australia over the past years, even with the signing of the Paris Agreement. And perhaps this is to keep competitive with the nearby neighbouring China. Nearby is a relative term here. Australia is kind of far away from, well, most places. It was literally half a world away from the UK, part of why it was originally used by the British as a place for penal colonies. As for China, they are a whopping 7,000 kilometers away, yet still feel like they are often in the Aussies' backyard. If we look at a Waterman map instead of a traditional Mercator map, which takes more of a butterfly shape than a rectangle shape, we'll see just how far it is. Beijing is around the same distance from Cambria as it is from Warsaw, Poland. However, due to both bordering the South China Sea, Australia and China have increasingly had to interact with each other over the past century, as both, especially China, have grown in power. Though culturally and strategically close to Western nations, and even taking part in military exercises with and hosting military bases for the United States, there have been attempts by the Australian government to further open and encourage trade with the Chinese. However, the Chinese government has been fickle to work with. After the Morrison government requested an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19 in 2020, a variety of Australian meats just so happened to be deemed unimportable in China. The issue of coal also comes up here as well. Whilst Australia may be the world's 5th largest coal producer, China sits at number 1. China is known around the world for engaging in large-scale projects in foreign countries, seeming to benefit them strictly at first, but often in exchange for power and influence over them as time goes on. The so-called China problem, a problem relatively near to Australia's own shores, is one that does not have a simple solution, at least not in the current state of the world. China and coal presents a catch-22 for Australia. Do they appease the Chinese and establish further trade relations? Do they move away from them and get to continue a traditional closeness with Western nations? Do they export more coal to grow their economy? Or do they stop mining it altogether and focus on eco-friendly solutions and protecting the environment? Though its large size and huge swaths of near uninhabitable land make much of it hard to live in and difficult to traverse, Australia is a rich, modern nation that is given both a level of security and access to resources through its natural geography. As the climate crisis accelerates and the often hot lands of Australia get hotter and the oceans creep higher up the coastlines, only time will tell if or how Australia will put its geography to work to adapt.